He died screaming, but no one outside the stone walls heard him. They said he passed quietly in the night. They said it was an illness. They said it was peaceful, but that was not the truth. What really happened inside Berkeley Castle was too horrific to record, too shameful to announce, so they buried his body, sealed the story, and whispered the rest. A deposed king, a cold dungeon, restraints that bit into his wrists, and then silence, until the pain began, until the metal was glowing, until his own guards turned away, unable to keep watching. This was not a death. It was a warning carved into flesh. Edward II, once crowned with gold, died with a scream that echoed through stone. And what happened next was worse than execution. Edward of Caernarfon was never supposed to be the kind of king England needed. Born in 1284 as the fourth son of Edward I, he was raised in castles filled with rules, soldiers, and war stories. His father was a towering figure who was relentless in battle, ruthless in policy, and entirely devoid of softness. Edward I expected his sons to mirror that strength. Most didn't live long enough to try. Edward of Caernarfon did, but he didn't mirror anyone. From an early age, Edward was different. Where his father trained in weapons and law, Edward took interest in music, swimming, thatching roofs, and surrounding himself with common laborers. He preferred the company of stonemasons to statesmen, spoke easily to servants, and had a strange love for animals, simple games, and romantic songs. To some, that made him charming. To his father, it made him weak. By the time Edward became heir, his reputation was already cause for concern. When his father died in 1307, the crown did not settle on a strong jaw or a battle-hardened hand. It rested on a man who had never commanded an army, never governed a province, and never earned the trust of his nobles. His coronation marked the beginning of one of the most unstable reigns in English history. Edward's court quickly fell into disarray. He appointed friends and favorites to powerful positions, bypassing experienced lords and long-standing allies of the throne. Most infamous of all was Piers Gaveston, a young knight with sharp clothes, sharper wit, and no royal blood whatsoever. Edward adored him. He gave him lands, titles, wealth, and attention far beyond his station. They were inseparable. Whispers of an intimate relationship followed them everywhere, but it wasn't just the closeness that caused tension. It was the arrogance. Gaveston mocked nobles to their faces. He insulted the Queen's relatives. He strutted through court with the confidence of a prince, knowing the king would defend him at any cost. That cost would be heavy. By 1312, barons had enough. Gaveston was captured and executed by a group of enraged lords. Edward was devastated. He wept, withdrew, and never truly recovered. But he learned nothing. He simply replaced Gaveston with another favorite, Hugh Despenser, and repeated every mistake. Only this time, the consequences would be worse. England did not have a steady hand on the throne. It had a man driven by emotion, loyalty, and obsession. He was not cruel by nature, but he was blind to danger. He believed love could protect him. He believed the crown would shield him. He believed the court could be ruled like a private household, with friendship above law, and feeling above duty. But Edward's world was not built on friendship. It was built on knives, and one by one, they began to point at him. Before we move on, we want to thank you for listening. We really like making these videos, and would highly appreciate it if you subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Let's move on. When Edward II ascended the throne in 1307, he brought with him not a council of war-hardened nobles or seasoned advisors, but one man, a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston. Their relationship was already infamous by the time Edward became king. Gaveston had been exiled by Edward I for growing too close to the prince, not just politically, but personally. The exact nature of their bond remains debated, but what mattered then, and still matters now, is how Edward governed like no one else existed. Within months of becoming king, Edward recalled Gaveston from exile and showered him with titles and power. He made him the Earl of Cornwall, a title usually reserved for royal blood, and gave him wealth, land, and influence far beyond his station. The nobility were outraged. To them, Gaveston was an upstart with no claim to anything beyond moderate knighthood. But to Edward, he was everything: advisor, companion, shield. The court became a circus of arrogance. Gaveston mocked the other nobles, giving them cruel nicknames and belittling their status. Edward didn't stop him, though. He laughed with him. While England faced financial strain and threats from Scotland, the king spent his time in tournaments, extravagant feasts, and personal retreats with Gaveston. It was more than favoritism. The nobles tried to be patient. They sent letters. They begged for reform. They even tolerated Gaveston's growing power for a time. But Edward pushed too far. He began excluding his own lords from councils. He entrusted royal authority to Gaveston alone. Military decisions, taxation, foreign diplomacy, all filtered through one man, whose only qualification was the king's affection. By 1311, the barons had reached a breaking point. Under the ordinances of 1311, they forced Edward to exile Gaveston once again. But the king waited barely a year before bringing him back, defiantly, recklessly, as if daring the nobility to challenge him. That challenge was answered with steel. In 1312, a group of nobles led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, captured Gaveston as he fled north. They held a sham trial, found him guilty of treason, and executed him without royal permission. He was run through with a sword and left in a ditch. Edward was devastated, but he did not weep in private. He swore vengeance. Instead of reconciling with the lords or calming the kingdom, he turned inward, bitter and paranoid. He began surrounding himself with new favorites, men even more ruthless than Gaveston had ever been. The death of Piers Gaveston didn't end anything, it accelerated it. It confirmed to Edward that his enemies were everywhere, that love could be taken, and that power was something to grip tighter, not share. And into that space, that cold, vengeful space, stepped Hugh Despenser. He wouldn't just comfort the king, he would help ruin him. Despenser was clever, ambitious, and utterly without restraint. Where Gaveston had mocked the nobles, Despenser destroyed them. He didn't want popularity, he wanted control, and Edward gave it to him freely. Despenser quickly became the king's closest advisor and constant companion. His influence stretched beyond courtly favors. He was granted land, authority, legal immunity, basically anything he asked for. Together, Edward and Despenser ruled with arrogance and brutality. Despenser began targeting powerful noble families, especially those who had supported Gaveston's execution. Their lands were seized under questionable legal claims. Accusations of treason were thrown like knives, often with no evidence. The Marcher lords in Wales, who had long defended the kingdom's borders, were stripped of property and forced into submission. Despenser was building a private empire under the king's name, and Edward allowed it. England was already strained. The country was reeling from famine, economic crisis, and the lingering failures of war. Now, under Despenser's shadow, even the illusion of justice vanished. Nobles who had once stood by the king now considered open revolt. They weren't just angry, they were cornered. Their wealth, honor, and lives were all under threat. In 1321, rebellion erupted. The Marcher lords struck first, launching raids against Despenser's holdings in Wales. The violence spread quickly. Armies marched. Castles fell. Towns were pulled into the conflict. Edward's authority collapsed in entire regions of the country. The rebels issued a list of demands, but at the top stood one name, Hugh Despenser. They wanted him gone. Edward responded with hesitation. He agreed to Despenser's exile temporarily, but it was a trick. Months later, with the rebels distracted, Edward recalled Despenser and raised an army. At the Battle of Boroughbridge in 1322, He crushed the rebellion with brutal efficiency. Thomas of Lancaster, the king's cousin and one of the leaders of the revolt, was captured and executed. His head was displayed as a warning. Dozens of noble families were disinherited. Their lands were swallowed by Despenser's growing estate. The victory gave Edward the confidence to double down. He granted Despenser even more power, control over royal finances, appointments, and the law itself. But this wasn't peace. It was suppression. The barons had been defeated, but the people were still watching, and among them was one figure who had lost more than land: Queen Isabella. She had been silent while Edward tore apart his kingdom for his lovers. But now, with the court poisoned, the crown tarnished, and Despenser ruling unchecked, she began to plan, not a rebellion, a removal, permanent, violent, and final. By 1322, England was no longer ruled by a king, it was ruled by a pair. Edward II sat on the throne, but it was Hugh Despenser the younger who held the knife, and he wielded it with precision. What began as influence became dominion. Together they turned the crown into a weapon against their enemies and used the kingdom like it was personal property. Despenser, now restored from exile, returned with a vengeance. The royal pardon he received was just a shield. Behind it, he carried out a campaign of pure revenge. Every noble who had supported the Marcher Rebellion was targeted. Castles were seized, manors looted, wives imprisoned, and entire bloodlines broken. Despenser's legal tricks became state policy. Men were forced to sign over property or face false charges of treason. Those who refused were executed. Edward gave Despenser full control over royal appointments, courts, and treasury decisions. Even bishops and judges found themselves replaced with Despenser's men. Men who were loyal not to the law, but to the man who had become more feared than the king himself. England's nobles no longer appealed to the monarch. They begged Despenser for mercy. At court, fear became the language of survival. Dissent was crushed before it had a voice. Despenser spies moved through the halls, listening, reporting. Entire families disappeared overnight. Edward watched it all and said nothing. He no longer trusted his barons, his people, or his wife. The only man he believed in was the one tearing the country apart. Meanwhile, the common people suffered under the weight of famine, heavy taxation, and military failures abroad. Scotland was slipping beyond control, and yet Edward focused not on defending his realm, but on defending Despenser's power. War efforts were underfunded, troops unpaid, morale broken. The situation grew so bad that even church leaders began to protest. The Archbishop of Canterbury warned the king that Despenser's tyranny was driving the country toward collapse. But Edward didn't listen. He couldn't. He was no longer capable of separating loyalty from dependency. Isabella, Queen of England, had watched her husband's descent with quiet calculation. Despenser had insulted her, cut off her income, and stripped her household of authority. She was isolated, both politically and personally. Her marriage was a formality now. Her role was ceremonial, until it wasn't. In 1325, Edward sent Isabella to France to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV. It was meant to be a diplomatic gesture, but she turned it into a defection. She refused to return. She sent word that she would not come back, as long as Despenser remained by the king's side. Edward dismissed her warning, and by doing so, he signed the beginning of his own downfall. Because Isabella wasn't just angry, she was building an army. By 1325, Queen Isabella was no longer just a royal figurehead. She was a woman with nothing left to lose. Despenser had taken everything from her: her power, her dignity, her husband. Edward II had allowed it. He had stood by as her household was dismantled, her income slashed, and her status reduced to a shadow. She was the Queen of England, yet treated like a prisoner in her own court. But Isabella had patience. She had watched Despenser make enemies across every corner of the kingdom. Nobles hated him. Commoners feared him. The church condemned him. And Edward, blind to it all, kept him closer than ever. While Despenser grew bolder, Isabella grew quieter until her silence became a weapon. In 1325, Edward made a mistake. He sent Isabella to France to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, King Charles IV. It was supposed to be routine. She was meant to return quickly, but she didn't. Instead, she stayed in Paris, and in her absence, something changed. Away from Despenser's spies and Edward's cold detachment, Isabella found her voice. She began assembling allies. One of them was Roger Mortimer, a former marcher lord, escaped from the Tower of London, living in exile. Mortimer had once led a rebellion against the king. Now, he and Isabella had a common goal: destroy Despenser and bring Edward to his knees. Their alliance quickly became something more. Gossip spread through the courts of Europe that the Queen and Mortimer were lovers, but whether or not it was true, it didn't matter. Their connection had become a political force. Together, they built a network of disaffected nobles, mercenaries, and foreign sympathizers. They plotted not a protest, but an invasion. Edward, back in England, was warned. He heard rumors. He received letters. He ignored them all. His faith in Despenser was absolute. Even as discontent spread and defections grew, he dismissed Isabella's threat as empty. He believed she would never dare raise arms against a king. He was wrong. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in Suffolk with a small force. It was not a grand army, but it didn't have to be. England was already waiting for them. Barons joined their banner almost immediately. Towns opened their gates. Even the Royal Navy defected. Edward and Despenser fled west, desperate to reach loyal ground. But the truth was already clear. They had none left. The kingdom wasn't rising in rebellion. It was rising in relief. And it wasn't Edward they were waiting for. It was the Queen. Edward and Hugh Despenser fled west, seeking refuge in the lands Despenser had claimed during his years of unchecked tyranny. On November 16, 1326, near L'Entresang, they were captured by a local lord, a former ally who had chosen survival over loyalty. The King of England was no longer a sovereign. He was a prize to be handed over. Despenser was immediately separated from Edward. He had been the real target all along. For years, he had ruled through terror, and now the revenge came just as swiftly. Within days, he was tried, condemned, and subjected to one of the most grotesque executions in English history. His mutilated body parts were sent across the country as trophies. Edward was spared the spectacle, but not the fall. He was taken in chains to Kenilworth Castle, then to Berkeley Castle. No crowd gathered. No procession followed. His reign had ended, not with a battle, but with disgrace. His captors stripped him of his royal seals, his robes, and his titles. Parliament, under the direction of Isabella and Mortimer, was called in early 1327. Under pressure and threat, Edward was forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, now crowned Edward III. The father was dethroned by his own blood. He wasn't even present at the ceremony. He was locked in a damp cell, guarded by men who had been given one order: keep him alive, but keep him quiet. But Edward wasn't meant to live out his days in disgrace. The silence wasn't enough. The humiliation wasn't complete. And what came next wouldn't be declared in official records, because Edward's final punishment would be carried out behind stone walls, far from any court, any priest, or any witness brave enough to speak. Berkeley Castle was never meant to be a royal prison. Cold, isolated, and damp, it stood in the Gloucestershire countryside, like a wound that never healed. This was where Edward II, once King of England, Lord of Ireland, and Prince of Wales, would be unmade, quietly, brutally, and without ceremony. They locked him in a stone cell beneath the castle's lower levels. No sunlight, no fire, just mildew, rot, and a constant dripping that echoed through the walls. His food was spoiled. His bed was straw. His guards were not soldiers. They were executioners in slow motion. Their job wasn't to kill him. It was to break him, bit by bit. For months, Edward was humiliated. His beard grew long and matted. His clothes were soiled and unchanged. Rats became company. His meals were intentionally poor, cold, wet vegetables, rancid meat, bread so hard it cracked teeth. Sometimes they fed him only water and scraps. Not enough to starve, just enough to weaken. But hunger wasn't the worst part. It was the knowledge. He knew he was no longer king. He knew his wife had turned against him. He knew his favorite had been butchered in the street. And he knew the men guarding his cell didn't see a monarch anymore. They saw a nuisance, a liability, a risk that could be solved with silence. Then, on the night of October 11, 1327, the silence was broken. A group of men entered the castle under cover of darkness. They didn't wear royal colors. They didn't carry writs or orders. They carried a single object, a red-hot iron rod, glowing in the dark like a curse. According to the whispers that survived, they held Edward down on the bed. They stuffed a horn or funnel into his body, through the anus, to avoid external marks. And through that horn, they pushed the iron, slowly, mercilessly, until it burned its way through flesh, muscle, and organ, until the screams could no longer be heard beyond the thick stone. He thrashed, he bucked, he screamed, and then he stopped. They left him there, the iron cooling in the corner, the body twisted and blackened from within. No royal doctor declared the cause of death. No funeral procession carried his body. For months, officials insisted he died of natural causes. But no one believed that. Not really. The same nobles who arranged his downfall also arranged the lie. His son, Edward III, took the throne, but refused to speak of what had been done. Years later, when he finally took power from Mortimer and executed him for treason, there was still no trial over his father's death, because the truth was too shameful. Edward II wasn't buried as a hero. He wasn't remembered as a ruler. He was remembered as a warning, a king humiliated, a husband betrayed, a man burned alive from the inside, and a death so cruel, history still tries to forget it happened. If you came this far, make sure to click the next video that's on the screen right now. Subscribe to stay engaged for more content,